Now, to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is happening in the diplomatic showdown between India and Canada at this moment, we're being joined by Mr. Terry Milewski. He's a journalist and also the author of Blood for Blood, 50 years of Global Khalistan Project. He's joining us live from Ottawa. Now, Mr. Milewski, this is something that perhaps no one expected. Till about 72 hours ago, India and Canada's relationship was on an even keel, but the comment that has been made by the Canadian Prime Minister has resulted in the relations between the two nations nose diving. The question that I want to ask you is this: the fact that certain Khalistani elements were getting refuge in Canada was something that is well known, but increasingly the perception is that the Canadian government appears to be backing the Khalistani separatists. Why is it so?
Well, I don't think they really know that they are backing Khalistani separatists. I think that the problem with a series of governments in Canada has been that they don't really get it. They don't see what they're falling for. They think that, well, the Sikhs say that they're persecuted in India and they seem like very nice people, and we feel sorry for them. They don't see much difference between mainstream Sikhs and Khalistanis. They think that Sikhs are all Khalistanis, and we should all sympathize with their desire for self-determination. In other words,
Mr. Milewski, if I can just interject there,
they're very naive.
If I can just interject there, when you say that probably the Canadian government and the governments before probably are naive and perhaps they do not seem to understand what the issue on hand is, but the Indian government has repeatedly said that there are Khalistani elements, there are Khalistani terrorists who are wanted by the government of India for carrying out serious crime, who are now getting refuge in Canada. You know, the fact that there was a referendum for the dismemberment of the Indian territory that was held at the time when Justin Trudeau was here in India for the G20 summit, you know, this should quite clearly tell the Canadian government that these individuals who are carrying out these referendums are in fact actively planning for the dismemberment of India. How does the Canadian government not get it?
Well, that part is that, see, there are different questions here. We've got to make some distinctions here between what we would call freedom of speech and Indians don't like, but no Western democracy is going to abolish freedom of speech because that would please the Indians, and crossing the line into the incitement of violence. The problem that we have in Canada at the moment is the latter. The problem that we have is that we haven't drawn a line beyond which people may not go, because that's inciting violence and glorifying terrorism, inciting terrorism. Other countries, Britain is an example, they've had this law for 17 years. The glorification of terrorism is a criminal offense, but not in Canada. In Canada, we have normalized the glorification of terrorism. We haven't introduced legislation to forbid it. We have life-size posters glorifying the Air India bombing, the Air India mastermind of that bombing, the Kanishka bombing, as Indians know it, in 1985, 331 innocent civilians destroyed. We have normalized the display of these killer posters, as I call them, advertising the names and pictures of Indian diplomats, painting a target on their backs to enable people to offer cash rewards for their home addresses, so that any nut who sees these posters and gets the idea and happens to have a gun or a knife can act upon it. We have the normalization of the glorification of terrorism, and we're not stopping it. It is the violence. That's the issue. The question of having a referendum, how do you stop people getting together and voting on a subject peacefully? That is
I'll come on the issue of referendum in just a bit.
Distinction.
Mr. Milewski, I just want you to answer one more important point. Now, the reason why the relations between India and Canada have been in a bit of a limbo for quite some time is because of the refuge that some of these extremists and terrorists have found in Canada. Are you saying that the Canadian government, by law, will not crack down on them?
Well, it depends how you interpret the law, right? I mean, like 20 years ago, I did a documentary for the CBC called Safe Haven, saying that Canada had been blind and foolish to allow so many dangerous people to plot, in plain sight in some cases, things like the Air India bombing. I mean, remember, maybe Indians don't know this, but remember, we had the suspects in the Kanishka bombing under surveillance, and we were wiretapping them for 3 months before the bombing, and we still didn't catch on and do something to stop it. We've been lax, and obviously nobody listened to my documentary because we haven't really changed since then. But I do insist that there should be a distinction made by Indian politicians. If you want to win this, if you want to bring this ship into safe harbor, if you want to get results, to focus on what is really the problem, namely the use of violence, rather than just speech. We can't stop people having a referendum. We can stop them, and we should stop them threatening violence. That's the problem.
All right, very interesting. My last final question to you is about the issue of referendum. When you say referendum probably is something that comes under the ambit of freedom of expression in Canada. But remember this, when these Khalistani separatists and terrorists hold this referendum, the way they want to dismember India is by violence. And by allowing these referendums to happen on Canadian soil, essentially the Canadian government is fomenting and in some ways is also building up these people by probably giving them the idea that what they're doing is the right thing, which the Canadian government backs. Does the Canadian government back a referendum for the dismemberment of India?
No, they don't. They say that they respect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of India. That's been the official position of Canadian governments. The problem is they don't really act against the Khalistanis, who have infiltrated into Canadian politics. They are members of all of the leading political parties, and they have a nice little arrangement with the politicians where you come to my Vaisakhi parade and you smile and wave and hustle for votes while the parade floats go by carrying portraits of martyrs garlanded in gold tinsel, celebrating their acts of terror. And I've agreed to look the other way, and you've agreed to vote for me come election time. All the parties are playing the same game. And remember, of course, that the Trudeau minority government is sustained in power by the votes of a small party, the NDP, left-wing party, led by Jagmeet Singh, who's a Khalistani sympathizer. So we acknowledge, I certainly acknowledge, that Canada has done a terrible job of dealing with this file, has been naive, gullible, and just plain dumb, and not getting India's complaints, not dealing with those complaints proactively. But I do think that the Indian government here, they know what Trudeau knows. Modi wasn't sitting there like a potted plant when Trudeau came in to see him at the G20, and they had a brief and frosty meeting, which by Trudeau's account, he raised this matter in no uncertain terms, I quote. I don't think Modi sat there like a potted plant and didn't ask, okay, what are you saying? What is your evidence? So if Trudeau won't reveal it, and I agree with you that he must reveal it, he's got to put flesh on the bone. He's got to say what if he has the goods. And if he doesn't, I think Modi knows more than he's letting on, and that he could and should step up and say, okay, I know what he's alleging, and here's why it's rubbish. But all this other stuff about why Canada's a bad country for entertaining terrorists and all of this, and all cutting back on diplomats and visas and travel advice, that's all noise. The core issue here is what evidence does Trudeau have?
I think you've touched on the nub of this issue. What evidence does Trudeau have, and will Trudeau now put forth that evidence? Because that is what, this entire controversy hinges upon. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Milewski, for joining us and getting us all those insights, because at this moment, everyone wants to know what evidence prompted Justin Trudeau to make the comment that he did. Because if he can't back up the allegation with evidence, then he is on a very, very weak wicket. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.